Let me paint a picture for you. See if this sounds familiar. Imagine a couple in their early 30s. Both of them have solid careers. She works in marketing and earns about $62,000 a year. He works in IT, bringing in around $71,000 annually. Together, their household income adds up to $133,000. On paper, that's impressive. In fact, that income level places them roughly in the top 25% of households in the United States. So, logically, life should feel comfortable. They should be building wealth, contributing heavily to retirement accounts, and enjoying the occasional vacation without stress. Financial security should feel within reach. But that's not their reality. Instead, they feel constantly pressured by money. Most months, their income barely stretches far enough to cover everything. Saving feels slow and difficult. In fact, if they're honest, they probably only have 2 months of expenses saved, maybe even less. Last month, when their car suddenly needed repairs, they didn't have the cash ready. The bill went straight onto a credit card. Both of them work full-time jobs, and often even longer hours than that. By the time evening comes, they're exhausted. Weeknights usually consist of a few tired hours together before going to bed, and doing it all again the next day. What makes it even more confusing is that they did everything they were told to do. They went to college. They built stable careers. They got married and combined their finances. They purchased a home in a neighborhood with good schools. In other words, they followed the exact path society promised would lead to financial stability. So why does it feel like they're barely staying afloat? Why does a household earning well over 6 figures still feel financially fragile? If you've ever looked at your combined income and thought, "We make too much money to feel this broke," then what you're about to learn might explain a lot. Before we go further, let me introduce myself. Welcome to Stickman Finance, where we simplify money and investing so it actually makes sense. If you want smarter financial strategies and less stress with your paycheck, subscribe now and hit the like button. Let's get into it. If you and your partner are both working hard, bringing in 2 paychecks, and yet it still feels like it's never quite enough, you're definitely not alone. Millions of families feel the same way. And here's the strange part. For decades, we've been told a very simple story about money and family life. 2 incomes are always better than 1. At first glance, that idea seems completely logical. Think about it. If one person earning $50,000 can support a household, then 2 people each earning $50,000 should be able to support that same household and still have an extra $50,000 left over for saving, investing, and building wealth. It's basic math. 2 paychecks should mean more security, more freedom, and a better financial future. But something strange happened over the past few decades. For many families, that extra income never actually translated into extra security. In fact, in some cases, it created the opposite effect. Instead of feeling safer financially, households with 2 incomes often feel more fragile, more pressure, more risk. And this pattern has a name. It's called the 2-income trap. The phrase was introduced by Elizabeth Warren long before she became a U.S. Senator. Back in 2003, when she was still a professor at Harvard University, she studied thousands of families who had filed for bankruptcy. Along with her daughter Amelia Warren Tyagi, she analyzed more than 2,000 bankrupt households. What they discovered was shocking. Families with 2 working parents were actually more likely to go bankrupt than families with only 1 income. Think about that for a second. Working twice as hard, earning 2 paychecks, following the modern career path exactly as society recommends, and somehow ending up more financially vulnerable, not less. That's not just bad budgeting, that's a system problem. And chances are, many people are standing right in the middle of it without even realizing it. To really understand how this trap formed, we need to go back in time for a moment, specifically to around 1970. The way families worked financially was very different back then. At that time, only about 43% of women were part of the workforce. In most middle-class households, there was one primary earner, typically the father, while the other parent, usually the mother, stayed home to manage the household and take care of the children. And here's the part that often surprises people today. That single income was usually enough. Not barely enough, not constantly stressful, actually enough to support a middle-class lifestyle. According to data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and historical U.S. Census records, a typical middle-class family in 1970 could buy a median-priced home while spending roughly 25% of their income on housing. That left plenty of room in the budget for everything else. Families could afford basic healthcare, a car, groceries, and everyday living costs. Public schools were generally well-funded, so parents didn't feel intense pressure to move to a specific expensive neighborhood just to access a good education for their kids. And in many cases, families still had money left over for savings or the occasional family vacation. But perhaps the biggest advantage wasn't just affordability, it was flexibility. If something unexpected happened, maybe the main earner lost their job or got sick, the stay-at-home parent had the option to enter the workforce. That second potential income acted like an emergency backup plan. It was financial insurance that the family could activate if they really needed it. So even though households only relied on one paycheck most of the time, they still had a hidden safety net waiting in the background. And that safety net gave families something modern households often lack today: breathing room. Now let's jump forward to today. The structure of the typical household has changed dramatically. Today, about 57% of women participate in the workforce, and the percentage is even higher among married mothers. In modern America, the two-income household has become the norm, not the exception. In fact, in more than 60% of married couples with children, both parents are working. Think about what that means. The backup plan that families once relied on, having a second adult who could enter the workforce if necessary, has now become the default operating mode. In other words, the emergency reserve income has already been activated, and at first glance, that seems like progress. After all, two incomes should mean more financial power, right? Well, here's where things get interesting. According to data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the median household income in 2023 was around $74,000. When adjusted for inflation, that number is significantly higher than what the typical household earned back in 1970. So technically, modern families are earning more money than their parents or grandparents did. But there's a catch. While income has increased gradually, the cost of living has exploded. Take housing, for example. When you adjust for inflation, the median home price in 1970 was roughly $200,000 in today's dollars. In 2023, the median home price climbed to over $400,000. That means housing costs have essentially doubled relative to inflation. And housing isn't the only thing that skyrocketed. Healthcare spending per household has increased by more than 600% since 1970. Childcare, an expense that barely existed when one parent stayed home, now costs many families over $11,000 per year per child, sometimes much more in expensive cities. So yes, families today earn more, but the cost of maintaining a middle-class lifestyle has risen even faster. Housing and childcare are only part of the story. Over the past few decades, many of the core expenses tied to a middle-class life have increased dramatically. Take education, for example. Since 1980, the cost of college in the United States has increased by more than 200% after adjusting for inflation. For families who want to help their children attend college, that's a huge financial burden waiting in the future. When you add everything together, housing, healthcare, childcare, and education, the fixed costs of being a middle-class family have exploded. Meanwhile, wages have increased, but only slowly. So what ended up happening to that extra income from the second paycheck? For most households, it didn't turn into savings or wealth. It simply got absorbed by rising costs. Every additional dollar earned by the second worker gradually disappeared into higher housing prices, childcare bills, healthcare premiums, and other unavoidable expenses. The result is surprising. A two-income household today doesn't necessarily have twice the financial security of a single-income household from the past. In many cases, they actually have less. Why? Because their entire lifestyle now depends on both incomes continuing indefinitely. The second income is no longer extra, it's already committed, and that creates a hidden risk. If anything interrupts one of those incomes, a job loss, an illness, burnout, or even the need to care for a family member, the entire financial structure can suddenly become unstable. What used to be a backup plan has now become the baseline requirement. And that's the heart of the two-income trap. But maybe you're thinking something like this. Okay, that might be true for some people, but we're careful with our money. We didn't let lifestyle inflation eat up our second income. That's a fair point. So let's break down what actually happens to that second paycheck in a typical household. because when you look at the numbers closely, the results are often shocking. Let's walk through a simple example. Imagine a household where one partner earns $70,000 a year and the other earns $50,000. Together, that adds up to $120,000 in total income, which sounds like a very comfortable number. But instead of focusing on the total, let's zoom in on that $50,000 second income and see what actually happens to it. First, there are taxes. Because of the way the U.S. tax system works, income is taxed in brackets. The first portion of income is taxed at lower rates, but additional income gets stacked on top and taxed at higher marginal rates. That means the second income often faces a higher effective tax rate than the first. By the time you combine federal income tax, payroll taxes, and possibly state taxes, that $50,000 salary might lose 30 to 35% right away. So the $50,000 quickly shrinks to roughly $32,000 to $35,000 in take-home pay. Now let's add another common expense: childcare. When both parents work, someone needs to watch the kids during the day. In the United States, the average cost of daycare is around $15,000 per year per child. If a family has just one child, that childcare bill alone can wipe out almost half of that second income. Now, the remaining money might already be down to around $20,000 or less, and we're still not finished. Because when both parents work full-time, there are other costs that quietly appear. Costs that many people don't notice until they actually break them down. Things like commuting, transportation, and maintaining a second work schedule. And those costs can easily eat up thousands of dollars every single year. When you start adding them together, the second paycheck doesn't look nearly as big as it first seemed. There's also a psychological trap hiding inside all of this. On paper, the numbers look impressive. When you see a $120,000 combined income on your tax return, it creates the feeling that you should be financially comfortable. And because of that, many families start making spending decisions based on that full combined income. You buy a house based on what two salaries can qualify for. You finance cars that two paychecks can support. You commit to a mortgage payment that assumes both incomes will continue indefinitely. From the bank's perspective, everything looks perfectly fine. A lender sees two steady incomes and says, "Yes, you can afford this $400,000 mortgage." Technically, they're right. You can afford it, as long as both incomes keep coming in every month without interruption. But life rarely works that way. People lose jobs, companies downsize, someone might get sick or burned out, a child might need extra care, a parent might need help as they age. Unexpected things happen all the time. And when a family has built their entire financial structure around two permanent incomes, there's no safety margin. This is where the trap really snaps shut. Back in the 1970s, a single-income household often had a hidden advantage. If the primary earner lost their job, the stay-at-home parent could step into the workforce. It wasn't ideal, but it provided a backup plan. Modern two-income households have already used that card. Both incomes are already committed to the monthly bills. So if one income suddenly disappears, the family doesn't just lose money. They can struggle to maintain their fixed expenses, even for a short time. That lack of margin is exactly why the two-income trap can become so dangerous. This lack of financial margin helps explain something that surprised many economists. A 2019 study by the Federal Reserve found that nearly 40% of American adults couldn't cover a $400 emergency expense without borrowing money or selling something. 40%. And many of those people aren't unemployed or struggling to find work. A large number of them are actually part of dual-income households earning decent salaries on paper. So what's going on? The problem isn't always low income. The real issue is that expenses tend to expand until they consume almost every dollar coming into the household. And here's what's interesting. Most of the expenses that swallowed up that second income weren't luxury purchases. Families weren't necessarily spending the money on yachts or extravagant vacations. Instead, the money went toward core middle-class costs: housing, childcare, healthcare, education. These are the basic costs of participating in modern middle-class life. Take housing as a clear example. When most families relied on one income decades ago, home prices were naturally limited by what a single salary could afford. But as two-income households became common, families suddenly had twice the purchasing power when competing for homes. And when everyone has more buying power, something predictable happens. Prices rise. Homes get bid up higher and higher because families can now qualify for larger mortgages using two incomes instead of one. Eventually, the market adjusts to this new reality. Now, the same type of home that once required one income to afford suddenly requires two incomes just to compete. It becomes a financial arms race where everyone increases their spending power, and yet nobody actually ends up with more security. So the big question becomes, what can families actually do about this? If you're already living in a two-income household, it's not always realistic to suddenly drop down to one income. Many families rely on both paychecks just to keep up with their current expenses, and that's exactly why this situation is called a trap. But there is a powerful mindset shift that can make a huge difference. Instead of treating both incomes as permanent and guaranteed, start thinking about your second income as temporary, even if it isn't. Most households do the opposite. They build their entire lifestyle around the assumption that both incomes will always exist. They buy a house that requires two salaries. They finance multiple cars that need two paychecks. They structure their monthly life around money that must continue flowing forever. That approach removes flexibility. A different strategy is to build what you could call a one-income foundation. The idea is simple. Try to design your core monthly expenses so they could theoretically be covered by one income alone. The second income then becomes something far more powerful. It becomes a tool for building wealth instead of just paying bills. That extra income can go toward building an emergency fund, investing for retirement, paying down debt, or creating financial breathing room for the future. Over time, something remarkable begins to happen. Savings grow, investments compound, options begin to appear. And that's the real goal. Not just earning more money, but creating flexibility. Because the families that succeed financially in the long run aren't always the ones who earn the most. They're the ones who protect their margin, keep their expenses under control, and refuse to let their lifestyle consume every dollar they make. Once you understand the trap, you finally have the chance to step outside of it. Thanks for watching. If you found this helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a tip from Stickman Finance. Remember, smart money decisions today create freedom tomorrow. See you in the next video.